Text of Zhang Eileen Chang Chapter 8. The weather was strangely warm, hardly like winter. Maybe it's going to rain. A large, dark swarm of grasshoppers flew around the treetops. From a distance, it looks like the tree is smoking. Someone was banging a small gong from the front to the back of the village, shouting, "Have a meeting. Go to the village hall for a meeting." Everyone has to go. Yuxiang had no choice but to take her child with her because there was no one at home. She took Ah Zhao to the next door to find Jin Yuso and went with her. The golden root returns and goes away on its own. At times like this, it is always men fight against men, and women fight against women. Even in the venue, although there is no explicit rule, men and women still stand on each side. The meeting was held in the large courtyard in front of the main hall of Wusheng Temple. Everyone crowded around, shouted hello to acquaintances, and squinted their eyes in the afternoon sunshine. There is a table placed under the eaves in the middle of the hall. The director of the Farmers Association slapped a piece of bamboo on the table, and the venue fell silent. You could hear the crowing of chickens in the distance, as if you were dreaming. Then the director of the Farmers Association coughed and began to speak. Since Yuxiang returned to Xiangyi, she has been having meetings all day long. There are many more meetings here than in the lanes of Shanghai, but Yuxiang is still not used to having meetings. When it was time for everyone to raise their hands, she was always the last one to raise her hands. When doing this, the women all giggled, and the men were equally shy. They were very careful to look straight ahead and not to the people next to them, so as not to embarrass everyone. The smile was like saying, "This is just a courtesy. In fact, it is the same as making a donation and greetings. Although it seems ridiculous. Is this a thing now? Everyone is like this now." Hu Jing'an is in the crowd. The person behind him stood up and said, "I propose to invite Comrade Wang to speak." Everyone followed suit and applauded. Yuxiang's heart was beating fast. When others stood up to speak, no one clapped their hands, but when Jin Zhen opened his mouth, everyone clapped their hands together. But shouldn't she also clap her hands? She will be told as a joke. The wife will support her husband, and she will become the target of gossip in the village. But on the other hand, she felt that it was not appropriate for her to be the only one not clapping her hands, as if she was the only one who had objections. Just when I couldn't decide, it was very painful. The applause had stopped, and Comrade Wang had already walked up the stone steps and began to speak. His speech was very long and the topic was entertainment activities. The purpose of his speech today was not to inspire the masses, but to overwhelm Gu Gang. Later, he formally introduced Gu Gang to the crowd and asked Gu Gang to also tell them a story about cultural and recreational activities. It was already dark by this time, and an oil lamp was placed on the table. The audience was restless, but no one fled because the door was guarded by militiamen. Because Gu Gang was not prepared in advance, he had to come up with a few words to deal with the blame. The speech ended in less than a quarter of an hour. After the meeting, the crowd practiced Yanko dance in the open space in front of the temple. The light and shadow of the lanterns and torches danced on the red wall. The big gong and the small gong were struck one after another. Pa-ha-heng yi-heng, pa-ha-heng yi-heng. The young people wore scarves on their heads and raised their eyebrows and eyes, causing them to suddenly change their faces and become vicious and terrifying strangers. They began to dance, moving forward and back, shaking their arms. Golden roots are included. Women, old and weak, all gathered round and watched with smiles. But among the group of bystanders, a commotion gradually rose, and many people were squeezed out. Despite protests on the one hand, they were still pushed out and joined the dancers. A woman pulled her away, as if she was unwilling to give in. She dragged Yuxiang out of the crowd and shouted, "You can do one too, Mrs. Jin Zhen." Yuxiang chuckled and tried her best to resist, but finally he was forced to stand in the queue. She had never danced, and her ancestors had not danced for more than 1,000 years in southern China. She found this behavior very funny. In fact, when she was in Shanghai, she once saw female students and female workers performing Yango on the street, and she thought it was a fashionable thing at the time. The torches were finally blown out, and the lanterns dispersed, slowly following the others. Everyone walked home. Yuxiang was sweating coldly under her cotton-padded jacket. She was too tired, but she felt a little light and strangely excited. She has always liked excitement. She held out Zhao's hand and walked side by side with Jin Yuso. In the darkness, she could hear Jin Zhen's voice talking to someone else. Although she couldn't see him, hearing his voice from a distance had a sense of comfort and made her feel happy. The moon is behind the clouds. Layers of clouds gathered together to form a cave, and the entrance of the cave was tinged with amber light. It started to drizzle, but the moon was still there, a dim light in the amber cave. Before they got home, it was already raining heavily on the last stretch of the road. Everyone was running wildly. Jin Zhen arrived home first. The oil lamp had just been lit and was still smoking a little. "It's so heavy, like a big stone," Yuxiang complained. "I'll cheer you up." As soon as she sat down, someone was already banging outside. 8. Jin Zhen walked to the door. The sound of rain on the roof tiles and the gurgling rain running down the eaves made him shout loudly. "It's Jin Yuso, here to borrow a wash basin, a pot, a wok or a water vat. Comrade Gu's house leaked," she said. "We took everything and picked it up, but it still wasn't enough. Everything got wet." Yuxiang helped her carry a big vat over and saw that their place was in a mess. Gu Gang's things were moved to Antan's room and piled up in disorder, where the old couple were discussing how to sleep tonight. Yuxiang came back and told Jin Zhen, and Jin Zhen went over and invited Gu Gang to spend the night with them. The old couple frowned and laughed at the same time, not daring to show their joy. "Okay, then," Antan said hesitantly. "Just let Comrade Gu Gang stay at your place for 2 days, and then move here after our roof is repaired. We will repair it as soon as possible anyway." But after all, they still didn't dare to send Gu Gang out without permission. Boss Tan put on his spiked boots and held an umbrella. He went to the temple in the rain to find Comrade Wang and asked him for instructions. With Comrade Wang's permission, we started to carry the luggage here. Yuxiang cleaned out the room where Jin Hua used to live. Antan helped spread Gu Gang's bedding. Jin Yusao was a widow and it is inconvenient to deal with some things. But their whole family came with them and took good care of them. Gu Gang was as overjoyed as they were about the move, and like them he was covering it up and not wanting to show it. Azal circled around the objects in his cage, touching this and that. She was very courageous, because among these children, Gu Gang always looked at her differently. Mr. Tan and Mrs. Tan finally stood up and laughed. Mrs. Jin Yusao held the umbrella for them. It rained so hard that they cursed and laughed. As soon as the guests in the house left, their voices became much louder, and even their coughs became louder. Now it was Jing'an and his wife's turn to whisper. Gu Gang could hear them talking softly in the next room, as if there was a patient at home. Only the little girl sometimes suddenly broke in and shouted a sentence or two loudly, without any scruples. He sat on the bed, facing the oil lamp, and suddenly his heart was filled with homesickness, missing his own home and wife very much. He pushed the bamboo lampstand a little further to make room, spread out the letter paper, and wrote a letter to his wife. He told her how he had to move hastily tonight because of the leak in the house, how kind the farmers were to him, and how touched he was by their concern for him. He also talked about his teaching situation in the winter school and told about his speech on recreational activities today. The wind howled at the throat on the horizon. The walls made of bamboo rattled. His room was divided into 2 rooms by a bamboo wall. The other half belonged to Mr. Tan and his friends, who raised a pig. The pig grunted uneasily because of the sound of the wind and rain, and because it couldn't stand the strips of light leaking through the wall and reflecting on the ground. Gu Gang was halfway through writing when his hands were frozen. He opened his hands to warm himself by the small flame of the oil lamp. The door behind him creaked, and the flame flickered and almost went out. He turned around and saw Yuxiang walking in with a smile. She looked even more gorgeous in the light. He felt that she seemed to appear in a dream, just like those stories said. A beautiful statue in a temple in a deserted mountain made a scholar very confused when he saw it, and he dreamed of her that night. "Engu Wang, Comrade Gu," she said. She brought a basket with a few hot coals covered with ashes. Antan used to bring it to him every night. It was her idea at first, but he protested I put it on, but it didn't work. Later I thought it would be good to have such a thing on my feet, because it was so cold at night. Antan must have told Yuxiang just now that he needed one every night. He really hated that old woman, too thoughtful. No one in this area uses this kind of basket except for the elderly and infirm. Antan brought it and put it under his bed. He didn't mind, but Yuxiang brought it and made him. She felt very ashamed. In her eyes, he had become an old woman, right? Body Mamao, he murmured. Don't bother next time, she smiled at him, no trouble at all. She left. The basket protruded high under the quilt, and the foot of the bed seemed to have a hump. He sat down on the bed forlornly, turned around and stared at it. He has never been so afraid of the cold as this winter. It must be due to nutritional deficiencies. He laughed again and wrote a letter, but the oil lamp gradually dimmed. He impatiently moved the wick of the lamp, poking it here and there, but the lamp went out. His matchbox was nowhere to be found in the dark. I don't know where it went when I moved. There was no option but to go to bed. The rain was still falling like a drum. He was so hungry that he couldn't sleep. Thinking about the fragrance of the moon made him feel troubled. I don't know what she looks like when she doesn't wear cotton-padded jacket and pants in summer. He was always tossing and turning, and he was worried that he might kick over the basket, burn the bed sheets, and maybe even burn down the house. It was almost on when he finally made up his mind. The next day, when the rain stopped, he walked to town to post letters and ate in a restaurant as usual. But before he came back, he bought some food and carried it back in his pocket, something he had never done before. He bought some dried red dates and tea eggs. He felt guilty because he lived with the peasants and had to eat whatever they ate. After he ate tea eggs and red dates that night, he carefully wrapped the eggshells and date cores with a piece of paper. In the morning he went for a walk with the bundle in his pocket. It's really strange. The countryside is so big and untidy, but there is literally no place to throw garbage like this. He had to go far away, to the hills, and scatter the eggshells and date stones in the long grass. Yuxiang washed his socks and handkerchief. When the sun went down, she collected the washing, neatly folded his socks and handkerchiefs, and sent them to his room, perhaps planning to stay there for a while and talk. The fact is that she does not hate this city man, and it is not absolutely impossible for him to rubbish with her or flirt a little, although she will never admit to herself that she has such intentions. It wasn't dark yet, but it was already dark in his room, but the lights hadn't been lit yet. She stood at the door and didn't see him eating a tea egg at first. When she understood, her face turned red and she stood there in a dilemma, as embarrassed as he was. Then she said, "Your socks are dry, Comrade Gu." She smiled hastily at him, put the things on his bed, tried her best to look natural, and left hurriedly. During dinner, Gu Gang brought the remaining tea eggs to the dining table and wanted to cut them into pieces for everyone to share. He explained in embarrassment that he had bought it when he went to town that day, and had left it there when he brought it back, forgetting to take it out to eat. He actually said these simple lines very badly, which made him very annoyed. Their attitude is not very good either. Anyway, as long as it is related to food, they can no longer deal with it with a natural attitude. Food had become nothing short of an obscene thing, rousing the lowest and most savage instincts in them all. Yuxiang forced a smile, with a very ugly face, and repeatedly gave in, telling him to keep it for herself. Jin Zhen grabbed both arms and pushed his hands away desperately. But in the end, they had to accept it because of politeness. Dinner that day was very unpleasant. There was nothing to say on weekdays, and it was even quieter that day, with no one speaking. From that time on, their attitude towards their guests grew colder. Since that day, Yuxiang rarely came to Gu Gang's room. Before each visit, she would always speak loudly to others to give him a warning in advance. She seemed to think he might be eating there at any time of the day. He felt offended by her assumption, which seemed insulting. As Zhao never enters his room now, obviously he is prohibited from doing so. He never saw Zhao peeking at him eating, but her mother probably caught her peeking there many times. Suddenly, he would hear yelling, scolding and beating outside, and the child would burst into tears. He went to town more often, but every time he went he still had to make an excuse. There is really nothing to buy in the town. He often buys red dates because they are replenishing. He also buys iron hard hemp cakes, 5 inches in diameter and wide, and small hemp cakes called money cakes. He had eaten it before, but he had never noticed that it sounded so loud when he tasted it. I couldn't close the door during the day, so I had to sit with my back to the door and eat. He felt that it was a shameful experience to eat secretly like this. But in any case, it did alleviate the pain of hunger and mental uneasiness, allowing him to continue working. One afternoon he was basking in the sun in the yard writing the story of the dam. Yuxiang sat under the eaves sewing clothes. Her child was standing next to her. Gu Gang was engrossed in his work and didn't notice what was happening there at first. There was a stubborn look on the child's face as she rubbed against her mother. In the past, with great force, Yuxiang was pushed and swayed from side to side even though she ignored her. The child sometimes muttered in a low voice, not knowing what he was talking about, and hummed in his nose, making a resentful sound. Sometimes she tugged at her mother's sleeve in despair. "What's the fuss about?" Yuxiang suddenly shouted and threw her away. "What do you want?" "Yasan. He is just a beggar who is a target. He will die if he is nailed by you. Relax. You are a born beggar. Do this every day, no matter if there is anyone around you. Why don't you die? Yakuza. Why don't you die?" The child started to cry, raised his arms, and took turns using both sleeves to test tears. Yuxiang never stopped mending her clothes, nor did she look at the child. She just repeated those words over and over again. Just as her anger had gradually dissipated, suddenly another wave of anger surged upward. With a decisive movement she laid down the garment which she had mended, and pinned the needle on it very carefully so as not to lose it. The kid knew from experience that disaster was coming. She was so anxious that she twisted her hands round each other and murmured something. Gu Gang watched from the side and was very surprised. This little girl of 5 or 6 years old showed fear and anxiety, just like the over-the-top performance of a bad actor on the stage. Her thin little face looked strangely old. She seemed to be the most primitive human being, encountering an irresistible, powerful enemy. At this moment, Gu Gang had an unreasonable impulse and almost wanted to turn around and run away, as if he was the one who was threatened. Yuxiang grabbed Ah Zhao and hit him on the head. The child starts to cry. "It's time to play around, Mrs. Jin Zhen." Gu Gang walked up to them and wanted to pull them away. "The child is not sensible. How can you be serious with her?" Okay, forget it." She ignored him completely. So much so that his interference only caused her to hit her twice more. She finally stopped and sat down again to mend her clothes. Ah Zhao stood in the center of the courtyard and cried. "And Tong, kiss me hard," Yuxiang shouted sternly. Gu Gang returned to his seat. The sun soon went down, and he went back to his room and brought the chair inside. Yuxiang didn't even look at him. That night, the child was very timid and quiet. After she fell asleep, Yuxiang sat next to her doing needlework, feeling a little regretful in her heart. She suddenly said to Jin Zhen, "We will also sell some meat during the Chinese New Year and make some food for Zhao." It turns out she still has money left over, Jin Zhen thought. She didn't lend it all to her mother. He shouldn't think that way. He thought it was despicable, just like the way he was spying on her. But he couldn't help but think so. Having said this, she felt remorseful again, and turned to look at the sleeping child's face. If she hears it and it's serious, then there will be no meat to eat, and she will die. She chuckled shamefully. But after a while, she said thoughtfully, "Actually, I only need a little lard. Buy some lard to make rice flour dumplings. Bean paste filling. Children all love sweets."
Alright, this part of the story ends here.
Want to know what happened next? Let's listen to the breakdown next time.